I was standing outside my own house with a grocery bag in my hand when my daughter-in-law locked the door. I heard the click. I knocked once, then again, harder. She opened the door just enough to look at me, her face calm, almost annoyed, and said, "You can't come in anymore. This isn't your house." My neighbors were watching. I turned toward my son, who was standing right behind her. He wouldn't look at me. I said his name, once, twice. "Tell her to open the door." He stared at the floor. That's when I knew this wasn't a misunderstanding. I asked if I could at least use the bathroom. I had been out all morning. She laughed and said, "You should have thought about that before causing problems." Then she threw my shoes onto the porch. One of them landed upside down. I had lived in that house for over 20 years. I paid the mortgage. I raised my son there. I cooked his meals in that kitchen. I held his children in that living room. And now I was being kicked out like a stranger in front of the whole street. I looked at my son again and said, "Are you really going to let her do this?" He finally spoke. Not to her, to me. "Please don't make a scene," he said. That sentence hurt more than the locked door, because in that moment, I understood something very clearly. My daughter-in-law didn't throw me out of my home. My son allowed it. I didn't scream. I didn't cry. I picked up my bag, bent down to grab my shoe, and walked away while people pretended not to stare. As I reached the end of the driveway, she shouted one last thing after me. "And don't come back. We've changed the locks." That was the day I became homeless, not because of money, not because of strangers, but because of my own family. And what they took from me wasn't just a house. It was done carefully, legally, on purpose. I didn't understand what was happening at first. I was standing on the front porch of my own house, balancing a grocery bag on my hip, when the door closed in my face. Not slammed, not angrily, just closed, deliberately. Then I heard the lock. That sharp click echoed louder than it should have. I knocked once, thinking it was a mistake. Maybe she thought I had already gone inside. Maybe my son would open the door and laugh it off. Instead, the door opened just a few inches. My daughter-in-law stood there with her arms crossed, blocking the entrance like a guard. Her face was calm, almost bored. "You can't come in anymore," she said. "This isn't your house." For a second, I didn't respond. My mind tried to catch up with the words. I looked past her, into the hallway I had walked through every day for over 20 years. I could see my shoes by the rack, the family photos on the wall, photos I had paid to frame. Then I looked at my son. He was standing behind her, just far enough back that she was between us. His eyes were fixed on the floor. "Tell her to open the door," I said, "now." He didn't move. I said his name, louder this time. He shifted his weight and sighed like I was inconveniencing him. "Mom, please don't do this out here," he said. "The neighbors are watching." That was when I realized something important. He wasn't embarrassed by what she was doing. He was embarrassed by me reacting to it. Across the street, a curtain slid aside. A man slowed his car as he passed. Someone was watching from the house next door. People I had greeted for years were now witnesses to my humiliation. I knocked again, harder. "I live here," I said. "You don't get to lock me out." My daughter-in-law smiled, not kindly, not nervously. It was the smile of someone who knew they had already won. "You don't live here anymore," she said. "We've talked about this." No, she had talked about it. She stepped fully onto the porch and shut the door behind her, forcing me to step back. My grocery bag slipped from my arm and hit the ground. A carton of eggs cracked open. Milk leaked across the wood. She looked down at the mess and shook her head. "This is exactly the problem. You're always causing scenes." I felt heat rise to my face. I wasn't causing a scene. I was being thrown out of my own home. I turned to my son again. "I need my medication," I said. "Let me go inside for 10 minutes." She laughed. "You should have planned better. You're always forgetting things." That was a lie, but she said it loudly, loudly enough for the neighbors to hear. I saw a woman across the street nod to herself, as if this explained everything, as if I were unstable, confused, a problem. That was intentional. She wanted them to believe I deserved this. I said, "I paid for this house. I paid the mortgage. I raised you in it." My son finally looked up. "This isn't about that," he said. "You're just making it harder for everyone." Everyone. Not me. Everyone else. I bent down to pick up the groceries. My hands were shaking, not from fear, but from rage I was trying to keep inside. My daughter-in-law kicked one of my shoes off the porch and onto the driveway. "If you don't leave, I'm calling the police." I waited. I waited for my son to say, "Stop." I waited for him to tell her she had gone too far. He didn't. Instead, he said, "Let's cool down and talk later." Later. I picked up my bag, the broken eggs dripping onto my sleeve, and walked down the driveway while people pretended not to stare. When I reached the sidewalk, she shouted after me, "And don't come back. We changed the locks." I didn't turn around, because I already knew. My daughter-in-law didn't throw me out of my home. My son let her. What made that day unbearable wasn't just the way I was thrown out. It was knowing with sick clarity that it hadn't happened suddenly. They had been preparing for it. When my son first asked if they could stay with me for a little while, he didn't sound desperate. He sounded reasonable, responsible. He said it would only be temporary, just until they saved enough for their own place. I believed him because I wanted to believe him. I cleared out my guest room myself, gave them the larger bedroom, bought new furniture so they would be comfortable. I told myself this was what a loving mother did, help her child get started. At first, everything seemed fine. Then, the small changes began. The first time my daughter-in-law criticized the house, she laughed afterward like it was a joke. "The kitchen feels so old-fashioned," she said. "This house could really use an update." I didn't argue. I nodded. I told myself it was just her opinion. When she started rearranging things without asking, I stayed quiet. When she moved my photo frames into boxes, I told myself I didn't want clutter anyway. When my favorite chair disappeared into the garage, I said nothing. Every compromise taught her something important, that I would step back. Soon, she wasn't asking anymore. She started deciding what groceries were bought, what food was cooked, where things were placed. If I did something differently, she corrected me loudly so my son could hear. "That's not how we do it," she'd say. And slowly, that sentence changed. It stopped being suggestion and became authority. My son noticed. I know he did. But every time I tried to speak to him privately, he shut it down. "Please don't fight with her. She's under stress. You're reading too much into things." He said those words so often they became automatic. When I told him I felt uncomfortable in my own house, he sighed and said, "Can you just be patient for a little longer?" Patience became my punishment. The longer I waited, the more she took. She started opening my mail before I saw it. When I asked her not to, she said she was just organizing things. She replaced the locks on the doors and told me it was for safety. "Don't worry," she said, "we'll give you a key." She didn't. When I asked my son about it, he said, "It's not a big deal." But it was, because it meant I needed permission to enter my own house. I started noticing how they talked about me when they thought I couldn't hear. "She forgets things. She's difficult. She doesn't understand how things work anymore." None of it was true, but they repeated it until it sounded convincing. And my son let them. He didn't correct her. He didn't defend me. He didn't stop it. He chose silence because silence kept the peace in his life. The first time she told me, "This is our house now," I laughed because it sounded absurd. The second time, I felt uneasy. The third time, I realized she meant it. By then, my place in the house had already shrunk. My belongings were boxed up, my routines were interrupted, my authority was gone, and I was still paying the mortgage. That's the part people don't understand. I didn't lose my home because I was careless. I lost it because I trusted my son, and he allowed his wife to erase me one decision at a time. By the time I stood on that porch, locked out while the neighbors watched, it wasn't the beginning. It was the end of something they had been quietly working toward for months. He didn't follow me down the driveway. That was the first thing I noticed. After she went back inside and slammed the door, after the locks clicked again like punctuation at the end of a sentence, my son stayed where he was, halfway between the door and the street, close enough to her to feel protected, far enough for me to avoid responsibility. I stood there, holding my broken groceries, milk soaking into my sleeve, and asked him one clear question. "Are you going to stop this?" He looked everywhere except at me. At the mailbox, at the pavement, at the houses across the street where people were pretending not to stare. "Let's not do this right now," he said. Right now? As if there would be a better time to be locked out of your own home? I took a step closer. "Open the door," I said. "Tell her to open it." He rubbed his forehead like I was exhausting him. "Please," he said quietly, "you're making it worse." Worse for who? Not for me. I was already standing outside with nowhere to go. Worse for him. I asked again, slower this time. "Are you going to do anything?" He didn't answer. That silence was not confusion. It was not fear. It was a decision. I tried one last time to talk to him away from her. I asked him to step toward the driveway with me, just a few feet, where she couldn't hear. He hesitated, then followed, reluctantly, like a child being pulled into trouble. I didn't yell. I didn't beg. I reminded him. "I paid the mortgage," I said. "I let you live here. I watched your children so you could work. I didn't ask for rent." He cut me off. "That's not the point." "It is exactly the point," I said. He shook his head. "You're overreacting." Overreacting? That word landed hard. I was homeless in front of my neighbors, and he called it overreacting? "I just want you to stop pushing," he said. "She's already upset." Upset? She had just thrown me out of my own house, and his concern was her mood? I asked him a question I already knew the answer to. "Did you know she changed the locks?" He hesitated, just long enough. "You're making assumptions," he said. "I'm asking," I replied. He didn't answer. That silence was louder than anything she had shouted, because it told me he knew, and he let it happen. As I stood there, I started replaying moments I had ignored before, moments that suddenly made sense. The first time she told me I was confusing things when I corrected her. The first time she said, "Let me handle this," and my son stepped aside. The first time she spoke about me like I wasn't in the room. Every time I looked for him support, he wasn't there. Not once. When she rearranged the house without asking, he said nothing. When she told me what time I could use the kitchen, he said nothing. When she laughed about me forgetting things, he said nothing. Silence became his shield. He told himself he was avoiding conflict. He told himself he was keeping peace. But peace for him meant war for me. Standing there on the driveway, I realized something that hurt more than the locked door. She didn't need to be cruel on her own. She had backup. He stood behind her physically that day, the way he had stood behind her emotionally for months, letting her speak, letting her decide, letting her erase me piece by piece. I said his name again. He finally looked at me then, but only for a second. "Please don't do this," he said. "People are watching." That was it. Not "this is wrong," not "I'll fix it," not "you can come inside." Just concern about appearances. I felt something settle in my chest. Not panic, not shock, but clarity. My daughter-in-law may have locked the door, but my son had already locked me out long before that day, with his silence, with his excuses, with his refusal to choose. He didn't need to push me out of my home. He just needed to stay quiet while someone else did it. And that made him just as responsible. She didn't stay inside for long. After a few minutes, the door opened again, slow and deliberate, like she wanted the timing to hurt. My daughter-in-law stepped back onto the porch, phone in her hand, keys dangling from her fingers so I could see them. She looked at me the way people look at something they've already decided to throw away. "You're really enjoying this, aren't you?" she said loudly. "Standing out here, acting confused." Confused. She said it slowly, stretching the word, making sure the neighbors could hear it. "You always do this," she continued. "You twist things. You forget what actually happened, and then you play the victim." I opened my mouth to respond, but she raised her hand. "See?" she said, turning slightly toward the street. "This is exactly what I'm talking about." My son stood behind her, silent, his arms folded across his chest. She looked back at me and smiled thinly. "You're a burden," she said. "You've been one for a long time." The word hit hard. Burden. She wasn't angry. She was precise. "You make everything harder," she went on. "You're always in the way, always needing something, always complaining." None of it was true, but that didn't matter. What mattered was how confidently she said it, how easily she painted me as a problem that needed to be removed. I said, "You don't get to talk to me like that." She laughed. "I absolutely do," she said, "because this stops today." She held up her phone. "If you don't leave right now, I'll call the police." I stared at her. "For what?" "For harassment," she replied immediately. "For refusing to leave when you're not wanted." Not wanted. She glanced at my son. "Tell her." He shifted uncomfortably, but said nothing. She continued, louder now. "We've already talked to people about this. You can't just show up and cause problems whenever you feel like it." That was another lie. But she stacked lies the way someone stacks furniture they plan to claim as theirs. "You're not stable," she said. "You forget things. You get emotional. Everyone knows that." I felt my hands clench at my sides. She wanted a reaction. She wanted tears, yelling, collapse. When she didn't get it, her expression hardened. "You see these?" She lifted the keys again and shook them. "They're ours now." Then she reached behind her and turned the deadbolt again, slowly, loudly, so I could hear it. Click. She didn't need me to lock me out. She needed me to see that I was locked out. "This is our house now," she said. "You don't have any say anymore." I said, "That house is in my name." She smiled wider. "Not for long." The words sent a chill through me. She hadn't said them by accident. She stepped closer, lowering her voice just enough to make it crueler. "You should have left quietly. Now everyone can see what you really are." I asked her to stop. She leaned in. "Or what?" Then she delivered the blow she knew would hurt the most. "You're not going to see the kids anymore," she said. "They don't need this kind of influence." My heart dropped. "You can't do that," I said. She straightened. "Watch me." She turned toward my son. "We've talked about this. You agree, right?" He hesitated. Then he nodded. That nod did more damage than all her words. She looked back at me, satisfied. "See? Even he knows this has gone too far." I realized then that this wasn't about removing me from the house. She wanted me erased. From the home, from the family, from the future. She raised her voice again so the street could hear. "Take your things and go. You're not welcome here." A woman across the road glanced over, then looked away. My daughter-in-law folded her arms, planted her feet, and delivered the final insult, slow, loud, and intentional. No one wants you here anymore. That was when I understood the truth. She didn't want me gone temporarily. She wanted me broken permanently. I didn't go far after I left the street. I sat in my car with my hands on the steering wheel, staring straight ahead, replaying her words over and over in my head. Not for long. She hadn't said it casually. She hadn't said it to scare me. She had said it like a promise. That's when the fear shifted from my chest to my stomach, because humiliation ends when you leave the scene, but planning doesn't. I thought about the mail, the envelopes that had gone missing, the letters she said she had already sorted, the way my son used to hand me documents and say, "Just sign here, it's routine." My hands started shaking. I drove to a quiet parking lot and pulled out the folder I kept in my glove compartment, the one with copies of old statements and paperwork I never thought I'd need. I flipped through it slowly, forcing myself to stay calm. Something was wrong. I noticed dates that didn't line up, signatures I didn't remember discussing, pages I didn't remember reading. And then I saw it, a copy of a form I recognized immediately because I remembered signing it, or at least I remembered being told what it was. My son had brought it to me months earlier, sitting at the kitchen table like it was nothing. He said it was just to help with paperwork, something temporary, something harmless. "You don't need to worry about it," he had said. "It's just in case." In case of what, he never explained. I trusted him. I didn't know that what I was signing wasn't protection, it was permission. I opened my laptop and searched public property records. My heart was pounding so hard I could hear it in my ears. I told myself I was overreacting, that this would be nothing. It wasn't nothing. The house was no longer listed solely under my name. There it was, in black and white, my son's name, her name, added. I stared at the screen, blinking, refreshing the page as if it might change. It didn't. I felt sick. I scrolled further, opening linked documents, reading words I never would have agreed to if they had been explained honestly. Power of attorney, transfer language buried in legal phrasing, signatures timed carefully. I remembered that day clearly now. My son had rushed me. He had stood over me while I signed. She had been in the room, quiet, watching. I asked one question. "Is this permanent?" He smiled and said, "No, Mom, it's just paperwork." Just paperwork? That's what people say when they don't want you to ask more questions. I closed the laptop and sat there, breathing slowly, forcing myself not to panic. I needed confirmation, not suspicion, not interpretation. I called the county clerk. The woman on the phone was polite, efficient. She didn't know me, didn't care about my story. She only cared about records. She confirmed it calmly. Yes, there had been a transfer. Yes, the documents were filed properly. Yes, the names were added legally. I asked if there had been any challenge. She said, "No, everything appears valid." Valid. I thanked her and hung up. My hands were numb. I called the bank next, asked questions I never thought I'd have to ask, about access, about control, about what could be done. They told me what I didn't want to hear. Without legal intervention, I had limited authority over the house I paid for. I sat there in my car, staring out the windshield, and felt something inside me collapse. This wasn't a misunderstanding. This wasn't a fight that got out of hand. This was planned. They hadn't thrown me out in a moment of anger. They had waited until the paperwork was in place, until control had shifted, until I couldn't stop them easily. My daughter-in-law hadn't been bluffing when she jingled those keys. She already knew. And my son had known the whole time. He didn't just stay silent on the porch. He had prepared for that silence months earlier, with documents and signatures and smiles meant to disarm me. I wasn't just locked out of my house. I was legally pushed aside. I leaned my head back against the seat and felt the weight of it settle fully for the first time. They didn't steal something after I died. They stole it while I was alive, while I trusted them, while I believed a son wouldn't do that to his own mother. And in that moment, the humiliation on the porch made sense. They weren't afraid of me. They had already taken what mattered. I sat in my car long after the engine cooled, gripping the steering wheel so tightly my hands ached. The street where I had lived for decades was only a few minutes away, but it might as well have been another country. I checked my phone. No missed calls, no messages, no apology, no instructions, just silence. Night was coming. I could feel it in the air, that shift when options start disappearing. I opened the glove compartment and stared at the few papers inside, as if they might tell me where to go next. They didn't. I had money, but not a home. I had family, but no access to them. For the first time in my life, I didn't know where I would sleep. I drove without a destination, then pulled into a grocery store parking lot and shut the car off. The lights buzzed overhead. People walked past with carts, laughing, arguing, living ordinary lives. I sat there, counting breaths, telling myself not to cry because once I started, I wasn't sure I could stop. I called a friend I hadn't spoken to in years. I kept the explanation short because long explanations feel like begging. She hesitated, just a second too long, then said I could stay for a night. Maybe two. She had a spare space, she said. Not a room, a space. I arrived with one bag. That's all I had taken. The rest of my belongings were still in the house I no longer controlled. She showed me to the garage, apologized, said it was temporary, said she hoped I understood. I told her it was fine. I thanked her too many times. I slept on a narrow cot under a bare bulb and stared at the ceiling until morning. The next day felt heavier. I woke early so I wouldn't be in the way. I folded the blanket carefully. I kept my bag zipped and close, like if I spread out even a little, I'd be asking for too much. I offered to leave during the day so she could have her space back. She nodded, relieved, and said that might be best. I spent hours in my car, driving aimlessly, afraid to stop anywhere too long. I ate a sandwich in a park and watched families sit together on benches. I tried calling my son. It rang until it didn't. I left a message I erased halfway through because it sounded weak. I texted once, "Please call me." No reply. I tried again the next day. Nothing. I asked about the kids. I asked if they were okay. I asked if I could see them, even briefly. The message showed as delivered and stayed there, unanswered. Later, I realized I had been blocked. That hurt more than sleeping in a garage, because cutting me off from the grandchildren wasn't accidental. It was a decision. Another door closed, quietly, without explanation. I went back to the house once, just to see it from the end of the street. I stayed in the car. The curtains were drawn. The driveway was empty. I felt like a stranger watching someone else's life continue without me. When a neighbor spotted my car, I pulled away. I didn't want the looks. I didn't want the questions. Word traveled fast anyway. A friend of a friend mentioned they had heard I was having a hard time. Another asked, carefully, if everything was okay at home. I said yes because saying no would require details, and details felt dangerous. I could already hear the version of the story being told without me in it. I moved again after a few days. Another couch, another apology, another reminder that this was temporary. I kept my voice low, my presence smaller, my needs invisible. Every night I lined up my shoes neatly by the door, ready to leave at a moment's notice. The hardest part wasn't the discomfort, it was the loss of dignity. Asking permission to shower, asking when dinner would be, asking if it was okay to make tea. Independence disappears quickly when you're displaced, even if no one says it out loud. Late one night, I sat alone in the dark, phone in my hand, scrolling through old photos. Birthday parties, school plays, holidays in the living room I no longer owned. I stopped when my chest tightened and my vision blurred. I didn't know how long this would last. I didn't know where it would end. I only knew that I was tired. Physically, emotionally, deeply tired. There was no plan yet, no comeback, no solution waiting in the wings. There was just survival, and the quiet understanding that I had been pushed into this place deliberately and left there to figure it out alone. There was a moment, sometime after the third unanswered message, when I realized something simple and brutal. Begging wasn't working. Not because I wasn't explaining myself well enough, not because I needed the right words, but because my son had already decided not to listen. Once that settled in, something inside me shifted, not into hope, not into strength, but into focus. The panic that had been buzzing in my chest for days quieted just enough for me to think clearly. I stopped asking what I could say to make them change their minds and started asking a different question. What exactly had they done? I went back to the paperwork. Not quickly, not emotionally. I laid everything out on the table and went through it line by line, the way I used to do when I had a real problem to solve. Dates, names, signatures. I wasn't looking for proof yet. I was looking for cracks. And there were cracks. Pages that referred to conversations I never remembered having. Documents signed on days I knew I had been rushed. Language that didn't match what had been explained to me at the time. I remembered sitting at the kitchen table while my son talked and talked, filling the space so I wouldn't ask questions. I remembered how quickly he had slid papers toward me. I remembered how his wife had watched quietly, not interfering, not reassuring, just watching. At the time, I had thought her silence meant neutrality. Now I understood it differently. I made copies of everything. I labeled folders. I wrote down timelines from memory, forcing myself to be honest even when it made me look foolish. Especially then. I needed facts, not pride. For the first time since being locked out, I wasn't reacting. I was investigating. I spoke to someone outside the situation for the first time, a former coworker I trusted, someone who had known me for years. I didn't dramatize it. I didn't cry. I simply explained what had happened and showed her the documents. She didn't hesitate. "That's not normal," she said. Those 3 words did more for me than any apology ever could have. She pointed to a line I had overlooked, asked why no one had explained it, asked why everything had been rushed. She told me to stop assuming incompetence and start considering intent. I hadn't wanted to think that way, but the evidence was starting to point in one direction. I didn't confront my son. I didn't send angry messages. I didn't show up at the house. That was important. Because reacting emotionally was exactly what they expected. It was what they had planned for. Anger would have made me predictable. Silence had made them confident. So I stayed quiet. I gathered more information. I made notes. I organized everything chronologically until a pattern emerged. Humiliation after paperwork, exclusion after signatures, silence after control shifted. This wasn't chaos. It was sequencing. And once I saw that, I understood something else just as clearly. If it had been planned, it could be challenged. Not with shouting, not with tears, but with facts. I wasn't ready to fight yet. I didn't know how far this would go or how ugly it might become. I knew only that the version of me who waited politely for fairness was finished. I wasn't looking for revenge. I was looking for leverage. And for the first time since I was locked out of my own home, I felt something steady beneath the fear. I was done surrendering. The first thing the advisor did was slow everything down. He didn't react to my story with outrage or sympathy. He spread the papers out across the table and read them the way professionals do, carefully, without assumptions. He asked me when I had signed, who had explained what, whether I had been advised independently. I answered honestly, even when it made me uncomfortable. He nodded once, then pointed to a paragraph I had missed. This, he said, is where they made their mistake. The documents weren't illegal on their face, that mattered, but they were incomplete. Disclosures that should have been explained were not. Authority that should have been temporary was written broadly. Consent that should have been informed was assumed. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't promise miracles. He said, "This can be challenged." That was all I needed. We moved forward methodically. Requests were filed. Records were pulled. Notices were sent. Not to accuse, not to threaten, but to put facts on paper where they belonged. Everything happened quietly. No confrontations, no emotional messages, no sudden visits. Silence, used correctly, is powerful. I stayed silent while the paper trail began to move. The first call came 2 days later. It was my son. His voice sounded different, tight, controlled, like someone trying to keep a lid on something boiling underneath. "Why are people contacting us?" he asked. Not, "How are you?" Not, "Are you okay?" "Because there are questions," I said. He sighed sharply. "You didn't have to do this." That sentence told me everything. If nothing had been wrong, there would be nothing to fear. He tried minimizing first, said it was all a misunderstanding, said paperwork always looks worse than it is, said I was overreacting again. I didn't argue. I said, "You should talk to your attorney." He went quiet. After that, the messages started coming from her. Angry, accusing, defensive. She said I was trying to destroy the family, that I was embarrassing them, that I was being vindictive. She demanded I stop what I was doing immediately. I didn't respond. The more official the process became, the louder they got. And the louder they got, the clearer it became, to everyone involved, that control was slipping out of their hands. Authorities don't care about family dynamics. They care about process, about disclosure, about whether someone was rushed, misled, or excluded from understanding what they were signing. Neighbors who had avoided eye contact before began asking careful questions. Family members who had only heard one side started hearing another. The version of events I had been painted into, confused, unstable, dramatic, no longer held up under scrutiny. Facts have a way of flattening lies. The house didn't magically come back to me. This wasn't a movie. What happened instead was slower and far more real. Access was restricted. Decisions were paused. Control was frozen until things could be properly reviewed. Leverage disappeared. My daughter-in-law stopped calling. My son left a message asking if we could talk things through. I didn't call back right away. For the first time since this began, I wasn't being pushed to react. I wasn't being rushed to sign. I wasn't being silenced. They had expected me to stay small, to stay embarrassed, to stay quiet. They hadn't expected me to understand what had been done to me or to respond without emotion. Justice didn't arrive loudly. It arrived in envelopes, in timestamps, in professionals asking calm, uncomfortable questions. And while nothing was resolved yet, something fundamental had changed. They were no longer in control of the story. Time passed in a way that felt unfamiliar to me. Not fast, not healing, just steady. The situation didn't suddenly fix itself. The house wasn't magically returned, and nothing was neatly wrapped up. What changed was where I slept, how I woke up, and how I carried myself. I wasn't moving from couch to couch anymore. I had a place again, temporary, modest, but mine. I could close a door and know no one would lock it behind me. The legal process continued quietly in the background. Papers moved, deadlines appeared and disappeared. Some things stabilized, some things remained unresolved. That was reality, not a storybook ending. I learned to live inside that uncertainty. A few weeks later, my son reached out. Not with urgency, not with panic, with caution. He said he wanted to talk. He said things had gotten out of control. He said there had been pressure, stress, misunderstandings. He said he never meant for things to go this far. He talked for a long time. What he didn't say mattered more than what he did. He didn't say, I was wrong. He didn't say, I should have protected you. He didn't say, I failed you. He said everyone had been overwhelmed. He said his wife had felt threatened. He said choices were made quickly. In his version, the damage was accidental. In mine, it was deliberate. When it was my turn to speak, I didn't raise my voice. I didn't argue point by point. I didn't demand apologies. I said one thing: I don't trust you. There was silence on the line. I told him I loved him because that part was still true, but love didn't undo what had been done, and it didn't restore what had been broken. I told him I wasn't ready to pretend this was just a rough patch. I told him distance wasn't punishment, it was protection. He asked what that meant. I said it meant I would no longer explain myself. I would no longer justify boundaries. I would no longer accept silence as neutrality. I didn't yell. I didn't cry. I ended the call. Some people might say that was harsh. Some might say a mother should forgive no matter what. I don't know. I only know that forgiveness offered too early becomes permission for it to happen again. I think about that porch sometimes, about the neighbors watching, about the door locking, about how small I felt in that moment. And then I think about where I am now, not triumphant, not whole, but standing. I lost a house. I lost access to a version of my family I thought was permanent. I lost the comfort of believing loyalty was automatic. But I refused to lose my voice. I refused to lose my clarity. And I refused to lose myself just to keep the peace. Some days I still wonder what I would do if my son showed up at my door tomorrow, if he asked to talk again, if he said the right words this time. I don't have that answer yet, and maybe that's the truth people don't like to hear. So I'll leave this with you. If your child allowed someone to erase you, would you forgive them? Is silence a betrayal or just weakness? And when family hurts you this deeply, is walking away strength or failure? I'm still living with those questions. Maybe you would answer them differently.